Imagine being called disrespectful by your own parents, just for asking them to pay back the money they owed you. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Nola, I'm 24, and 6 months ago my parents, Roy and Janice, borrowed $3,000 from me, claiming it was for an emergency. At first, I didn't mind helping them, but months passed, and they didn't even mention paying me back. I started feeling uneasy, and finally, I decided it was time to confront them. When I brought it up, I expected some apology or at least a plan to return the money. Instead, they got angry and called me disrespectful, saying I shouldn't question them about finances. My heart sank. I had never been so hurt by people who were supposed to support me. I realized this wasn't just about money, it was about respect and recognition. Then I found out they went on a weekend trip, spending money they claimed they didn't have. I couldn't believe it. I felt betrayed, but I also knew I couldn't let it slide. I started keeping track of all the times I helped them, every favor, every loan, and I planned how to get what I was owed without losing my dignity. I confided in my aunt, Greer, who had always suspected my parents' selfishness. She encouraged me to stand my ground and showed me I had the right to demand respect. At the next family dinner, I calmly presented all my evidence. Their anger couldn't hide their guilt. In the end, they agreed to repay me. I felt victorious, but also sad. I learned that standing up for yourself is never disrespectful, it's necessary. This was my story of betrayal, courage, and reclaiming what was mine. I approached my parents carefully, trying to stay calm. I wanted to handle it respectfully, but I also needed them to understand that this wasn't something I could ignore any longer. I reminded them about the money they had borrowed and asked if we could set up a plan for repayment. I thought it was a simple request, something reasonable. Instead, their reaction hit me like a wall. Roy's face tightened, and Janice's voice rose sharply. They accused me of being disrespectful, claiming I had no right to talk about money with them. I felt a sharp ache in my chest. I had never imagined asking for what was mine could cause such anger. I tried to explain my side, keeping my tone soft but firm, but they barely listened. It was like my words didn't matter. Every attempt to reason with them was met with defensiveness and blame, and I realized how little regard they had for my feelings. The betrayal stung deeper than I expected, and I sat there feeling small and powerless in the face of their fury. For the first time, I understood that this wasn't just about money, it was about respect, or the lack of it. Their anger, their refusal to acknowledge what they owed me, left me shaken but also determined. I couldn't let this go. Even though I felt hurt and stunned, something inside me started to shift. I knew I had to find a way to reclaim what was rightfully mine, even if it meant standing against the people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally. The room felt heavy, filled with tension, and I left with my heart racing, but with a new resolve burning quietly inside me. After that confrontation, I retreated to my small apartment, needing space to think. The silence was heavy, but it gave me room to process everything. As I sat alone, memories of countless small betrayals began to surface. It wasn't just about the money this time, it was the way my parents always favored Trey, brushing off my efforts and sacrifices like they were nothing. I remembered the time I covered Trey's entire college tuition because my parents claimed they didn't have the funds. I had done it willingly, believing it was helping the family, but they never even thanked me, and there was never any repayment. That moment, which once felt like generosity, now felt like another example of being taken for granted. It hit me that this behavior wasn't isolated. Every time I helped, every time I sacrificed, it was met with indifference or criticism. I started to see a pattern. I was expected to give, and they were allowed to take without consequence. The realization made my chest tighten, a mix of sadness and quiet anger growing inside me. Alone, I traced back years of these small slights, trying to understand why I had ignored them for so long. Each memory added weight, but also clarity. I began to see myself not as the disrespectful one, but as someone who had been repeatedly undervalued. In that quiet space, I promised myself I wouldn't let this pattern continue, and that I would find a way to reclaim both my dignity and what was owed to me. The heartbreak was real, but it sparked something I hadn't felt before: resolve. A few days after our argument, I overheard a neighbor talking about Roy and Janice's weekend getaway. My stomach dropped. They had taken a short trip, staying at a cozy cabin, laughing and enjoying themselves while claiming they couldn't afford to return the money they owed me. The realization hit me hard. I felt a swirl of emotions: anger at their blatant dishonesty, heartbreak at how easily they disregarded my feelings, and disbelief that they could act so carefree while I was struggling to be heard. It was more than frustration, it felt like a personal betrayal that cut deeper than anything I had faced before. For hours, I sat in my room, staring at the floor, replaying their faces and their excuses. The casual way they spent what was mine made me see how little my efforts and sacrifices had meant to them. I realized that this wasn't simply a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate choice to ignore my needs. Something inside me shifted. I knew I couldn't continue to let them walk over me. I couldn't stay quiet, waiting for them to suddenly feel guilt or decide to do the right thing. That weekend, their actions lit a fire in me. I promised myself I would take control of the situation, not out of spite, but because I deserved to be treated with honesty and respect. From that moment on, passivity was no longer an option. I would act, and I would make sure they understood the weight of their betrayal. I started thinking carefully about my next move, knowing I couldn't confront them the same way again without facing more insults. I needed a strategy that would let me reclaim what was mine without being shut down or ridiculed. Sitting quietly, I went through a mental list of everything I had done for them over the years: the loans I had covered, the countless favors, the emotional support I had given without hesitation. It was overwhelming to see it all laid out, but it made one thing clear: I wasn't just owed money, I was owed recognition. I decided my approach had to be calculated. Instead of getting into another heated argument, I would create a situation that forced them to see the consequences of their choices. I wanted them to understand, not just intellectually, but emotionally, what their disregard had cost me. For days, I mapped out each step, thinking about timing, what I would say, and how I could present the evidence of their behavior without giving them room to twist the conversation. Every memory of being ignored or undervalued fueled my resolve. I pictured the moment they would finally realize the depth of their betrayal, the guilt and shock on their faces. It wasn't about revenge for the sake of anger, it was about reclaiming my power and making sure they could no longer take me for granted. The more I planned, the stronger I felt. I could almost see the outcome clearly, and it gave me a quiet confidence that this time, I would not leave the table empty-handed. I decided it was time to take a more formal step and scheduled a consultation with a lawyer to understand how I could recover the money properly. I wanted a clear path, something that didn't rely on arguing or being dismissed. Having a plan in place made me feel calmer, more in control. At the same time, I began dropping subtle hints around extended family during casual get-togethers. I mentioned situations where my parents had been careless or avoided responsibility, framing it in ways that seemed like innocent observations. They smiled and acted like nothing was happening, pretending not to notice. But I watched closely, the brief flicker of unease in their eyes, the hesitation in their responses, even the way they avoided certain topics. Every small reaction was a clue, confirming that they were aware on some level. I carefully chose my moments, making sure no one could accuse me of being confrontational. It was quiet, deliberate, and satisfying in a way that felt different from anger. I was laying the groundwork, letting them experience tiny glimpses of accountability without giving away my full plan. Each gathering became an opportunity to test their reactions, to measure how they responded when faced with gentle reminders of their missteps. I started to see patterns, small cracks in the armor of indifference they usually wore. The more I observed, the more confident I became that when the time came, I could act decisively and make them fully understand the consequences of ignoring their obligations. I shifted my approach completely, choosing a softer tone whenever I was around them. I smiled more, spoke gently, and acted as though our earlier tension had faded away. They seemed relieved, almost eager to believe that everything was fine again. That response worked in my favor. The calmer I looked on the surface, the less they questioned my intentions. While they relaxed, I focused on gathering everything I needed. I went through old messages, screenshots, and bank records, organizing each piece carefully. Every receipt, every transfer, every note connected to the help I had given them found its place in a folder I kept hidden. It felt strange to document so much history, but it also brought clarity. Seeing the timeline laid out made me realize just how long I had been carrying the weight of their expectations. I continued acting lighthearted whenever we spoke, even joking occasionally, making sure they had no reason to suspect a shift in my mindset. They took my polite behavior as proof that the issue had passed, completely unaware that I was building a case stronger than any argument I could voice. I let them believe what they wanted while preparing for the moment when their actions would finally catch up with them. Inside, I was steady and focused, no longer reacting emotionally to their behavior. I felt like a storm gathering quietly, unseen but powerful. I didn't want a dramatic fight, I wanted resolution that couldn't be brushed aside. With each piece of proof I added to my collection, my confidence grew. They thought my kindness meant surrender, but it was simply the calm before a shift they would never anticipate. I wasn't rushing. I was preparing, patiently and deliberately, for the moment they would have no choice but to face the truth they kept avoiding. I finally decided to share everything with my Aunt Greer, someone I trusted completely. She had always hinted that she thought my parents could be manipulative, but I had never realized just how much she understood until I laid it all out. As I explained the pattern of behavior, the money, and the constant disregard for my efforts, she listened intently, nodding in understanding. Greer didn't just listen, she validated my feelings in a way that no one else had. She told me I wasn't overreacting or being petty. She confirmed that my frustration was justified and that I had every right to demand accountability. Her words carried weight, giving me something I hadn't felt in a long time, clarity. Then she offered advice I hadn't considered. Instead of confronting my parents behind closed doors or letting anger dictate my actions, she suggested I approach it in a way that made them accountable in front of family, yet without putting myself in a position of embarrassment. It was strategic, smart, and fair, a chance to make them face their choices without shame directed at me. Hearing her perspective shifted something inside me. For the first time, I could see a path where I reclaimed my power without losing my composure. The mix of betrayal and anger that had weighed me down started to transform into determination. I felt energized, ready to act, and certain that I could turn this situation into a moment of truth that they wouldn't be able to ignore. With Greer's guidance, I felt equipped and fearless. I realized I wasn't alone, and that validation gave me a sense of strength I hadn't known I needed. For the first time, justice felt possible, and I was ready to claim it. The night of the family dinner, I felt a steady determination as I took my seat. The conversation flowed casually at first, but I knew the moment to speak was approaching. When the right moment came, I calmly addressed the money they had borrowed, speaking clearly and without hesitation. I refused to let nerves or anger take over my voice. I had everything organized, a detailed record of each loan, bank transfers, and even the tuition I had covered for Trey. I laid out the facts plainly, showing exactly what had been given and how it had been used. I didn't shout or accuse, I simply presented the evidence, letting it speak for itself. As expected, Roy and Janice tensed immediately. Their defensiveness was palpable, and they began twisting my words, attacking my character instead of acknowledging the reality I had shown. Janice sneered, suggesting I was exaggerating, while Roy tried to make me feel guilty for bringing it up in front of others. I felt the familiar sting of betrayal, but I stayed composed. Each insult they threw only strengthened my resolve to stay calm and focused. I realized that losing my temper would only give them an excuse to dismiss me. Instead, I met their attacks with steady eyes and a firm voice, refusing to be intimidated. Around the table, I noticed family members exchanging glances, their curiosity growing as they followed the facts I presented. I could sense the tension shift subtly. I was no longer just the disrespectful one, they were forced to confront the consequences of their actions, and I could finally feel the weight of control returning to me. Just as the tension reached its peak, I took a deep breath and revealed the next step I had taken. Calmly, I told them I had already filed for repayment through small claims court. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything I had said before. Their faces drained of color, and for the first time, I saw genuine shock and unease. I explained how what they had called a small emergency had turned into years of taking advantage of my generosity, relying on me without gratitude, and expecting me to silently accept their behavior. I spoke steadily, pointing out the pattern of exploitation, showing how their choices had affected not just me, but the family's trust as a whole. The room fell silent. I could feel eyes shifting, some filled with disbelief, others with understanding. Slowly, family members began connecting the dots, recognizing the hypocrisy and unfair treatment they had never called out before. Their whispers and subtle nods showed they were realizing the truth I had been trying to convey for years. Roy and Janice attempted to regain control, but the impact of my words and the formal action I had taken left them cornered. For the first time, they were forced to face accountability, not just privately, but in front of everyone who had witnessed the story unfold. I felt a mix of relief and vindication, knowing my patience, planning, and restraint had brought this moment. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about exposing the reality of their actions, reclaiming my dignity, and ensuring they could no longer dismiss or manipulate me. The quiet power I held finally became visible to everyone in the room. After a long pause, Roy and Janice finally nodded, their faces tight with resignation. They agreed to repay the money, knowing they had no other choice. The acknowledgement was quiet, almost begrudging, but it marked the end of a long struggle I had carried alone. I felt a surge of relief and satisfaction, yet it was tinged with sadness. Winning back what was mine didn't erase the years of disappointment, the hurt of being undervalued, or the moments I had doubted myself. Justice had been served, but the emotional wounds lingered, a reminder of how deep the betrayal had cut. As I reflected on everything, I realized I couldn't go back to the same dynamics that had allowed this to happen. I needed to protect myself and establish clear boundaries. Limiting contact wasn't easy, but it was necessary for my peace of mind and sense of self-worth. For the first time in years, I felt fully in control of my life and my choices. I wasn't just reclaiming money, I was reclaiming respect, dignity, and the right to prioritize my own well-being. While the victory was bitter because of the pain that led up to it, it was also empowering. I knew I had acted wisely, patiently, and with intention, and that knowledge carried a quiet strength I wouldn't allow anyone to take away. The chapter with my parents had closed in one sense, but the lessons I learned and the boundaries I established would guide me for the rest of my life. I had stood up for myself, and in doing so, I had finally honored my own value. In the quiet days that followed, I spent a lot of time thinking about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the patterns I had ignored, and the courage it took to finally speak up all settled heavily in my mind. I realized how easy it had been to lose myself in the role of the dependable child, always giving, always patient, never questioning whether I deserved the same care in return. Looking back, I understood that standing up for myself had been long overdue. It wasn't just about correcting a financial wrong, it was about breaking a cycle that had left me feeling small for years. I learned that family doesn't excuse unfair treatment, and silence doesn't solve anything. Speaking up didn't make me cruel or ungrateful, it made me honest. As I processed everything, I found myself wanting others to understand the same truth. I wished someone had told me sooner that asserting your needs doesn't make you disrespectful, it makes you human. So I shared that thought, hoping it would reach anyone who felt trapped between loyalty and self-respect. The hurt from the betrayal didn't disappear, but something stronger grew in its place. Taking control, demanding fairness, and honoring my own worth brought a sense of healing I hadn't expected. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave it purpose. In the end, I walked away with more than repayment. I walked away with the understanding that reclaiming your power, even from the people closest to you, is not only possible, it's necessary. I carried that lesson with me, a quiet reminder that choosing yourself is not selfish. It's survival. Hey besties! Thanks for staying with me through this journey. Lending money, being dismissed, uncovering lies, and finally standing up for myself showed me how deeply family can wound you, and how powerful it is to reclaim your voice. Betrayal hurts, but choosing your own worth heals in ways you don't expect. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, drop a comment, and subscribe for more. See you in the next one. Bye.